G3 Chevy here, working on a 2001 GMC Safari, which is basically a Astro van. I am about to change the fuel pump on this vehicle. Watch a couple videos on YouTube of individuals cutting the floor to get easy access to the electric fuel pump. And after researching this, I feel that's probably the best way to do this, and saw a couple of photos online that showed how the access panel that you're making is secured back down to make the floor stable and rigid again, and also allowing you to gain access to it relatively easily in case you have to get back in there. Anyways, my vehicle has carpet in it. I know some of the videos that I've seen on YouTube, they were basically cargo vans that didn't have any flooring like we have in this vehicle. So it was a little bit of work getting the carpet out or pulled back. Had to take the side panel loose where the rear AC is housed. Had to pull up this bottom trim to get access to this part of the carpet, and I basically just rolled everything back. There's some Velcro up by the captain's chairs that kind of hold it under the front part of the carpet set, which is for the passenger and driver's side floor. But all this appears to be one piece. Was not glued down that I could tell, so it was pretty easy to roll it back. The hardest thing was getting access to these side panels to get underneath there to grab it, and the way the carpet is cut out, it loops around some brackets underneath the rear AC. So unless you want to cut your carpet, the only way you can do it is to remove this panel, pull it back, and you can see this bracket it hooks around. So I had to disconnect all that stuff. But anyways, about to put a cutting wheel on my template that I've drawn out here. And with anytime you're working with a fuel system, you want to be extremely careful. Got to disconnect the battery in case I nick some lines while I'm cutting the floor. But I will start the video back up once I get all that cut out and show you the top of the fuel pump assembly. Okay, I just cut through the floor of this van and got to the top of the fuel pump assembly, and I used this grinder with a diamond, I guess, impregnated steel blade made by Bad Dog Tools. I use this a lot on my automotive projects. I've had this a couple years, and I've literally cut up probably 3 parts cars with this thing, so I highly recommend it. It doesn't create a lot of sparks, which I like. It's a little bit thicker than your average cutoff wheel, but it did the job very quickly. I was very careful not to cut too deep. As you can see, this is really close to the wiring harness, not so close to the fuel lines, which is nice. There's quite a gap there, but unlike some of the other videos I saw, there's a I don't know if it's a bypass or check valve assembly off to the right of the fuel pump assembly. Not sure what that's all about, but this is the top of the fuel pump, obviously, with the 3 fuel hose connectors and the 2 plugs. So what I'm going to end up doing is getting a magnet with a little plastic on top of it, so when I pick up all these metal filings, I can just remove the plastic from the magnet and drop it in the trash can and not worry about it. Then I'm going to take a paintbrush and brush out all this dirt and stuff, and take compressed air and blow it all out so it's nice and clean when I remove this pump assembly. And it'll be ready for the new fuel pump whenever it arrives, hopefully this afternoon. Anyways, I'll start the video back up once I pull this thing out and show you what I did to get to that point. Also, I just wanted to point out that I used a wet towel to cover up my carpet jute backing so it wouldn't catch fire while I was grinding and cutting through all this metal. So that might be a good idea unless you've got like a welder's blanket you can lay over everything when you're cutting this panel open. So just a reminder, be careful with that. And like I said, I used a wet towel to protect my carpet. Okay, disconnecting the old fuel pump. These connectors are pretty easy to remove. The small one with the blue gasket on it had this pin on the side. I don't know if you can see that. That went in this slot when it was connected. So you have to pull that pin out in order to be able to flip this back to release it. This one was just a standard connector. You just lift it up and it unhooks from right there. Now these fuel lines appear to come apart when you squeeze these inner retainers inside, and then you got to push back pretty hard because it's the fuel line's stuck on there pretty good. It appears that the middle one's a little bit different. It doesn't have that inner clip. I think you gotta squeeze these together to get it to release, or maybe lift up to get it off of that ridge. But this one is the same as the one on the left hand side. So after that's disconnected, I'm gonna wipe all this down and vacuum it up one more time and make sure everything's nice and clean for the new fuel pump to go in. Got the fuel pump out, but I wanted to make a few notes here. This locking ring has these high spots on it to where they go inside these grooves to lock in place so it doesn't vibrate loose. Now, I had a hard time when I was pounding on this ring trying to knock them loose. These tabs would bend down, so I tried hitting these and it got me a little bit of room. But what I ended up doing when I got just a little bit of space in there, I took a flathead screwdriver and worked my way around and pried it till I got past that hump. And once I got that hump out of the way of that groove, I just tapped it out the rest of the way with a hammer and a screwdriver. So that was kind of a challenge, but so far that's probably been the most difficult thing, getting to this fuel pump. But also I want to note that once you get this lock ring off, obviously the pump is spring loaded, so it sits at the very bottom of the tank. Take this lock ring off. Couple things actually to note. These two outer hoses connect with a compression fitting or clip that goes around the pump outlet, whereas the inside hose has the retainer built onto the hose itself. So you need to basically squeeze this together to get it over that ridge on that nozzle or that connector. So these, from what I understand, remove and go on to the new pump. Still waiting on my new pump to come in. But the other thing I also wanted to mention is there is a notch on the opening of your fuel tank. this actually sits down in that notch and clocks a certain position, so it cannot be installed at the wrong angle. So underneath that is a rubber gasket, so you got to make sure that you put that back on when you put the new pump on, and make sure that that is in the notch so it compresses down far enough to where you can get the lock ring back underneath these tabs. And I'll mention that again when I put everything back together. Okay, a couple things to note. Here's the old fuel pump, which is slightly different from the new one. For starters, you can see the plugs are different, which they include a new pigtail to accommodate for the new plug style. Other thing is, the old pump has this sock filter, pickup filter externally. The new one does not. There's a sock filter of some sort inside here, so that's eliminated. And also there's only 2 rods that are spring loaded, versus the old one that has 3, and they said that that eliminates any possible rubbing on this pickup tube. Anyways, this is how the new one came, and you got to install the new rubber gasket and the float arm. And I said be very careful when installing this, because you don't want to put pressure on this side, because that's the contact for the fuel level sending to the fuel gauge. So if you mess that up, your fuel gauge will not work or will not read accurately. So I'm going to get this thing all ready to install, drop it in there, see how it fits, and we'll go from there. I also wanted to mention that I went with the Delphi FG0288 fuel pump, and that's what most folks online recommended. And with my experience with other fuel pumps in the past with pickup trucks and whatnot, I always recommend going with an OEM manufacturer. I know Delphi does a lot of stuff for GM. If not, try to go with like AC Delco if you got a GM. But never had any good luck with aftermarket stuff, especially with something so important as a fuel pump. Just spend the extra money, get the good stuff, and you won't be disappointed. Another thing to point out is the float level assembly is slightly different from the old one. You can see that the arm is positioned pretty much opposite of the old one, but the float itself is in the same general vicinity as the old one is when it's installed. So it's snapped into place real easy. Just be real careful not to put too much pressure on this upper side where the contacts are. But that's supposed to be how that installs. So it is slightly different from the old one. Again, there's several upgrades they did to this unit, which are supposed to be improvements over the old one, and we'll see how everything fits. Okay, these little clips are kind of tricky to get off. They slip over the opening and they clip behind that shoulder on there, and you have to get like a small flathead to get underneath it and pop it off without breaking it. So, and then you put it on the new one. So it locks the hose in properly. So anyways, that's how that snaps on there. So I got to take this one off and then put it on this outer one. The center one does not have that clip. It's actually built onto the hose itself. And then my next step is to figure out which wiring schematic to use to update my plug to compensate for the new connection. Okay, so the diagram I'm going to use is this top one, even though it says a purple wire. I've got a purple white, everything else is exactly the same color, so I'm going to take a gamble and assume that this is all the way it's supposed to be wired. Now, it comes with these crimp fittings that you can heat shrink the ends to seal it off, but I prefer these that have solder in the middle. They're a low temp solder that you put on the ends of the wires, and you just butt them up, slide this over where you butted them together, and heat it with a heat gun until that solder melts and shrinks it all down against the insulation of the wire to seal it off completely. I also go over it with heat shrink tubing to cover it up with an additional layer of insulation. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I've got my wires cut on the van. I'm going to get the heat gun fired up, connect all these, and plug it up and see how it works. Okay, I got the old pigtail cut off. I've got my gray wire, my purple with white stripe, heavy gauge black, and then a light gauge black with white stripe. So based off of that, I'm going to use this first combination of wiring to make this work. So I'm going to strip these real quick. Okay. So what I'm going to do, get these started on here. And the trick is to make sure your pigtail matches the wiring diagram color and meets in the middle, to where basically what you're doing is pushing these together so the strands are inside each other, so the solder will get a good fusion between the wires when it cools down. And also I go back over with this heat shrink tubing. So I've got kind of a double insulation there, and then I'll snug everything up with some electrical tape so it's not flopping around loose underneath my access panel that I created. Oh, already got that one. Okay. So the wiring diagram says connect the orange black to the black and white. So here's my black and white. That's actually purple white. My black and white's right here. Don't want to lose that guy. And you noticed I've cut all these different lengths, and that's on purpose, and I'll show you why here in a little bit. But here's my black and white. It's supposed to go to my orange and white, or actually orange and black. So black white from the vehicle, orange black to the wiring harness or the pigtail. So you slide this up, get that pushed in there, and you can see where the solder is right there in the middle. You want to push these two wiring splices together and then make sure it's centered over where the wires connected at or intersect at. And then I'm going to take a heat gun and fuse that together, and then once that's done I'll slide this additional heat shrink over it and then seal it all up one more time just to be on the safe side. Go. Once you see the solder turn a shiny silver, then you know it's melted. And then you wait for it to cool down, and then you can hit it with this. I don't know if you can see that. So it's a good solder connection instead of a crimp connection. And then I'm using a damp rag to kind of protect the rest of these wires while I do this. I'll put this remainder of heat shrink over that, and hopefully it'll shrink up enough to cover that. Otherwise I'll have to go to a smaller size. Alright, I'll do the other three wires the same way. Okay, got all these connected, and I'm going to wrap these with some electrical tape and put these inside this wire loom protector, and then I will wrap it around like this and probably put a tie wrap on it like that, and then hook up the battery and see how it works. Okay, the reason why I staggered where I spliced those wires together was so I don't have one great big bunch at one spot where I taped everything together, so it's staggered a little bit. Anyways, I'm going to try to push as much of that into the wire loom cover as I can, and then tie this off underneath so it's not floating around rubbing against anything, and we'll test it out. Okay, here's what I ended up with. Got everything connected, got plenty of slack in the wires if there is a next time, which I hope I do not have to do this again, but if I do, I have this access panel to work with, which is nice. So what I'm going to end up doing is making some brackets to tie into to screw some sheet metal screws through to hold this down, so in case it ever needs to be opened back up, it'll be pretty simple. And then go over the edges with some type of caulk. Actually, seam sealer is what is used in the automotive industry, so I'll seal all that off so no fumes get into the passenger compartment. So let me fire this thing up and see what happens. Okay, moment of truth. Let's see if the gas gauge works. Looks like it does, almost full, like it was before I changed the fuel pump. There you go. Definitely was the fuel pump. Now I just got to check for leaks, make sure everything's connected properly, and button everything up. Okay, this is what I ended up doing for patchwork. Put some sheet metal along the edges and riveted them to the floorboard. And what I'm going to do is come back, fold this down, and put some self-tapping sheet metal screws in the rest of it. That way it's easy to open up the access hole again in case I need to get back in there. Just got done with the self-tapping screws. Everything went together real nice. Make sure when you're drilling through to make the holes, you put a piece of wood underneath so you don't drill into your gas tank or any other item that might be underneath there that is of importance, so just be careful with that. Anyways, this worked out really well. It's nice and solid, and I'm going to put down some Dynamat, fill in the gaps here, and that should wrap it up. Okay, the Dynamat's down, went along the seams, packed it down real tight, used the back of a screwdriver or pick to get it down in there real good and tight, and sounds like an original solid floorboard. The Dynamat can be peeled off if you need to access it in the future, so that's why I went with the sheet metal screws on the inside and the Dynamat instead of seam sealer, which is kind of a more permanent sealant. So this wraps it up. This is a lot easier, I think, than dropping a tank full of fuel and messing with all that, so pretty happy with how this went. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks.